The Jets face the Atlanta Falcons tonight. It's the second preseason game of 2022. Who are the key players to watch? We will discuss on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, August 22nd, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or your first watch every day. This show is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Big shout out to subscribers to this podcast, and to join that group, just hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today, our episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Well, the Jets play the Falcons tonight, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. The game will be broadcast on ESPN. It's a national game. Most of the time in preseason, it's just local broadcasts. So if you're out of market, you have to kind of scramble, see the NFL Network schedule, maybe check what the NFL's streaming options are for that year. Everybody can watch tonight's game. It's on ESPN. It's also being broadcast locally on My 9 in New York if you don't have ESPN for whatever reason. Be an interesting game to watch. And if you're watching on YouTube today, of course, you see a little bit of a different background. I'm on the road this week and probably will be again next week. So a little bit of a change of pace if you're a loyal YouTube watcher. The Jets and Falcons actually kind of played a couple times over the weekend. The Falcons came up late last week for a couple of joint practices. The Jets and Falcons practiced together at Florham Park at the team facility on Friday and Saturday, and by most accounts, the Jets had the better of the play. So I don't know how much it means that the Jets are getting the better of the play against another team in practice, but if it counts, Jets did have the better of the play against the Falcons by all accounts, and that leads us into tonight's preseason game. Today we're going to talk about some key players to watch for the Jets, and there are plenty. There are more than you could name, because the reasons you watch players in preseason vary. There are some guys you just want to see, some guys you want to see if they can sustain, some guys you want to see if they can bounce back, some guys are fighting for their roster spots. It's much different than you watch a regular season game where the real focus is whether the team wins or loses. This is really about the Jets. It's really about individual players, who stands out, who wins jobs. So I'd like to talk about some of those players. Now, it's not entirely clear whether we're going to see the Jets starting players tonight, because Robert Saleh indicated on Saturday that he was really happy with the way they practiced against Atlanta, and he may change his plan up a little bit. It sounds like his original plan was to give the starters some action in this game, but based on what he saw over the weekend, perhaps we won't see the starters. And I feel like teams are still kind of navigating. They're still kind of trying to figure out how to deal with this 3-game preseason schedule. You know, in the past, what usually happened was your starters got maybe a series or two in the first game. You built them up a little more in the second game. The third game was when you kind of treated it as a dress rehearsal for the regular season. Starters played into the second half in many cases. And then the fourth game, starters may play one series, but the last game, you're trying to make roster decisions, so lots of backups. You don't want to get any of your key players hurt, and at any rate, it's like one last chance for players to prove themselves as roster cutdowns are made, and so fringe roster players would get to play that fourth game. And teams have taken all sorts of different approaches to this new 3-game preseason over the last couple of years. It's not clear. Again, Saleh said himself, he's not sure how he's going to handle things. So take this with a grain of salt, but I wanted to talk about some guys I'm going to look at tonight on each level of the roster. So I'm talking like first team players, second team players, and then maybe third or fourth team players, some key guys to watch. Now, if the starters play for the Jets, and there's no guarantee that they will, a guy I'd really like to watch is Garrett Wilson, who I thought looked really good last week against the Eagles. You know, one of the reasons I liked this draft pick is, and as much as I hate to say the guy has a high floor, and the reason I hate to say that is I've seen a lot of high floor players ultimately fail in the NFL. Every player in the NFL, doesn't matter where you're drafted, you can ultimately be a guy who's a total zero. But I think the odds of Garrett Wilson being a total zero are far lower than your typical wide receiver, and that's because of his route running skills. Typically, guys who go high in the draft, they're usually big, they're fast, they have amazing testing time, they're extremely athletic, some of them have great vertical leaps, but those are only things that help you play the receiver position in the NFL. They're not the things that necessarily guarantee you're going to be a great receiver. If you can't run routes, if you don't have any subtleties in your route stems, if you can't make sharp cuts, if you can't sell your moves, you're not really going to go anywhere as a receiver in this league. Garrett Wilson enters the NFL as a pretty refined receiver, and I think we saw that in the opener in the preseason against the Eagles, where even though the numbers weren't great, and part of that's because he wasn't playing that much, and there was the one throw where Zach Wilson really kind of overshot him, threw it over his head, but he looked like he belonged. It looked like he was getting open an awful lot. It looked like he's just a guy who knows what he's doing. I feel like he's kind of a technician out there, and I want to see if that can continue, because whenever you're putting a rookie out there, especially a rookie in a primary role for your team, you never know exactly what you're going to get. You can guess based on skill level, and this goes for anybody I talk about. I've been very high on Breece Hall, but we're not going to really know how good Breece Hall is until he plays in a real game. Garrett Wilson, you could see the season going any number of ways for him. You could see him being maybe just a supporting player for this team. You could see him really carving out a role for himself as a rookie, or you could see him maybe taking on a lead role in this offense. And it's not really clear which it's going to be. My guess is it's probably going to be a supporting role. I kind of like to split the difference in a situation like that, but he looked really sharp last week. It looked like he was running really crisp routes, and I would expect it to continue. And again, this doesn't matter if the Jets don't play their starting players tonight, and they may not, but if Garrett Wilson's out there, he's the guy I'm going to be keeping my eye on, because I thought it was a really encouraging debut based on the way he was playing. And again, he's not a guy who enters the league with a lot of the question marks you have for a rookie receiver. He enters the league relatively refined. You kind of knew what you were getting with him, to the extent you can know with a young rookie receiver. So can he continue it? Can he continue to look like a guy who could make an impact at least on some level this year? Now, on the other side of the ball, you have a guy who I thought played pretty poorly last week, and that's Quincy Williams. And Quincy Williams is kind of a wild card for this team, because the Jets were talking him up a lot during the offseason. And I think by all accounts, he exceeded expectations a year ago when he took the field. Listen, you get a guy off waivers from Jacksonville, you're not expecting him to play any good games for you. Quincy Williams played a number of really solid games, but he was kind of like one of those baseball players who hits a lot of home runs but also strikes out a lot, which I guess in this day and age is all Major League Baseball. But when he makes a big play, it really pops off the screen. There are lots of times where he gets himself out of position. So I would never want to say he wants to reduce his aggressiveness, because part of the reason he made so many plays last year was how aggressive he was. He was a big hitter. It was always exciting to watch him, bear down on somebody, but that aggressiveness came at a cost sometimes, because he'd run himself out of the play. He'd be in the wrong position. There may be a hole that he was responsible for filling. So the question is, can he channel it correctly? Can he maintain the proper level of aggression he needs to make plays, yet not make as many mistakes? And last week, in very limited playing time, he did not encourage. I mean, there was a late hit on Jalen Hurts out of bounds, and there was a play where he missed a tackle in the open field where he took kind of a bad angle. Now, he did have a little bit of help. There was a borderline block in the back call that was missed, to be fair to Quincy Williams, but I'd like to see a bounce back this week if he plays. Again, if he plays, this could all be moot if Robert Saleh just decides to go with the second teamers. Again, coaches are going to have different philosophies. I feel like coaches are still trying things out, how they're going to navigate this whole preseason thing with only the 3 games, and the joint practices, of course, add a different element, because they kind of, if you're using this game as a barometer for how you play against competition, well, the Jets saw this competition a few days ago. So all this is to say Quincy Williams may not even set foot on the field. But what I saw last week did not calm my nerves. And I don't want to overstate the importance of like 1 or 2 series in a preseason game, because, as I always say, first of all, the game doesn't matter. You're not game planning. I don't care what players say. I'm sure there's less intensity on the field in a game that doesn't really matter. All of this comes into play. And as I also always say, if you have a bad first quarter of a regular season game, by the end of the game, nobody's going to really remember that. They'll remember how you played over the course of the entire game. You have 3 quarters to bounce back. You don't really get that in a preseason situation. In a preseason situation, essentially you only get a handful of snaps. So one mistake can take on kind of an outsized role in your evaluation, how you're evaluated after the game. So with these caveats in place, I would like to see Quincy Williams bounce back. I'd like to see him, if he's on the field, have a strong performance and show at least signs he's going to channel that aggression a little bit better, because Jets talked him up a lot in the offseason. I heard the phrase Pro Bowl potential thrown around. We haven't really seen that yet, and we're not going to... Listen, if Quincy Williams goes out and plays great tonight, it's not like it's going to change everything. It would just be a nice first step along the road. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to focus on the second teamers. It could be a game where you see quite a bit of the second team offense and defense. And there are some players I'll have my eye on. I'll tell you who they are as we continue on this Jets Falcons preseason game preview. You know, another preseason game means that we're closer to the beginning of the regular season. The Jets and the Ravens will play in just a few weeks, and you should know that if you want to bet on that game or any other game, BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your betting needs. You can find all of your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, games, and lines. You can find reviews and news of every league. That includes Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, even combat sports, esports, and golf, and yes, the NFL. The season's just a few weeks away from beginning, and BetOnline continues to be the top online resource for all of your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, and podcasts. They have you covered. Head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. It is Fantasy Draft Week on the Locked On Podcast Network. No matter how you play, experts from Locked On Fantasy Football and Locked On Dynasty Football will bring you daily positional top 10 lists to get you ready for the season. Find Locked On Fantasy Football and Locked On Dynasty Football on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about Week 2 of the preseason. Jets are playing the Falcons. This could be a game where you see quite a bit of the second-team offense, second-team defense. Robert Saleh was non-committal about how much the first-teamers play in the first segment. We talked about a couple of the first-teamers who could be worth watching if they do get on the field tonight, but I'm focused as much on the second-teamers. And there are guys who need to step up. There are guys who can continue quality play. There are guys who need to bounce back. I think one of the guys who needs to bounce back is Mike White. I thought he had a rough game against the Eagles. And for Mike White, this kind of goes deeper because I was thinking this through, and everybody remembers that amazing game he played on Halloween against the Bengals, and then abbreviated action on the Thursday night game against the Colts a few days later, where it looked like he was really good. Then he struggled against the Buffalo Bills, and which I guess could be excused because the Bills, one of the best defenses in the league last year, maybe the top defense in the league last year, so lots of quarterbacks struggled against him. But I was thinking this through. This time last year, not many of us were confident in Mike White. And there was a reason for that. Mike White did not look good in the preseason. In fact, I was thinking this through. The only time I can remember Mike White playing well in a Jets uniform was that game against Cincinnati and then that quarter against the Colts, because he was bad last preseason. That preseason of 2020, there was no preseason because of COVID. Jets got Mike White. They actually signed Mike White during the season in 2019. So of the limited looks we've gotten at Mike White, most of it's been bad. There was one spectacular game against the Cincinnati Bengals. Outside of that, it hasn't been very good. Now, how big of a role is Mike White going to play on the Jets season? Probably not that big of a role. Joe Flacco's obviously the backup. Zach Wilson's going to be back sooner rather than later, it seems like. So maybe this is all an academic point, but I'd like to see something promising from Mike White, because at the end of the day, if the Jets do need to call on him, it's been tough to have confidence. And I think your confidence level will go down if he has another poor performance in this game. And you have to wonder how much of that was just how much of the Cincinnati thing was just kind of a fluky thing where he just ran into a career game against a team that really didn't properly prepare. It's tough to say. So I don't really know what to think of Mike White right now, but if he continues to struggle in the preseason, I don't really know where you go with him. And maybe the Jets have already moved on since they brought it back Flacco to be the backup quarterback. Another guy who could be on notice, and I think his roster spot is in peril, is Denzel Mims. We've spoken extensively about Denzel Mims, what a disappointment he's been. Last week, it's ominous. Now, he did have a couple of catches on third downs to extend the drive in the second half against the Eagles, but he also dropped a pass. And beyond that, he was involved in a penalty where the Jets got lined up incorrectly. That one may not have been his fault, but he dropped a pass. And even more ominously, he was the 7th receiver to enter the game. It just feels like Denzel Mims is fighting for his life right now. It feels like he's fighting for a roster spot. It feels like this could be a tipping point for Denzel Mims. And it's tough because at best he's the 5th receiver, and typically you want your 5th receiver to help on special teams. And Denzel Mims has been getting some work on special teams in practice. Can he play there? I mean, I kind of not sure. I'm inclined to be skeptical that he can. He may need to make a play on special teams in order to save his roster spot, though. He certainly needs to go out there and perform at the receiver position because it just hasn't happened for him. After a handful of kind of promising games his rookie season, it just feels like it's all fallen apart for him. And I don't know whether it's the mental part of the game. There's been, I don't know what it is. It seems like he just can't do anything right. It reminds me a bit of Chris Herndon a few years ago. Remember Chris Herndon had that really promising rookie season where it was one of the top 35 receiving seasons a tight ends had as a rookie in the NFL. And then it's like he forgot how to play. He couldn't catch. He couldn't hold on to the ball. Couldn't run routes properly. That's what I think of when I think of Mims right here. I just don't know what's happened. I know there was a coaching staff change, but leaving Adam Gase should not make you less productive, you'd think. Now, Mims may not be a classic fit for this offense, but it's really tough to believe how far things have fallen off for him after all the problems. I mean, this time, a year ago, a lot of us thought he could still have a big role in the offense, and now he's fighting for his life. And I would say right now he's probably an underdog to make the final 53-man roster for this team, just because we know the coaching staff doesn't seem to have a lot of faith in him, but his level of play has really done nothing the last 2 years to justify continued investment in his development. Now, the same is not true of Michael Clemens. I think Michael Clemens looked really good last week against the Eagles. And, a lot of it came in the second half where he was playing against guys who weren't that good. But even in the first half, I noticed some times where he was getting into the backfield, playing with a lot of power. A guy who is not going to be a huge impact player for the Jets this year, probably not going to have like a starting level snap count. But a guy who could potentially see some snaps as a rotational player. We know Robert Saleh likes to move guys in and out on the defensive line. So Clemens is a guy who could be playing his way into some playing time if he continues his production. He was just overpowering, and part of that comes with being an older guy, 25, 26 years old, and especially when you get into the second half of these preseason games, you're playing against guys who are kind of overmatched. You're playing against guys who are much younger. You aren't even really playing against many guys who have the fourth round pedigree Michael Clemens has. So he should be dominating in the second half of these games, but the fact he is shows he's doing what he's supposed to do. He's flashing that power, those strong hands that led the Jets to draft him in the 4th round. And if this continues, again, he could carve out a role on this team. Maybe he's not going to be an impact player. He's not going to be a 10-sack guy this year, but maybe he can get some snaps. Maybe he can rotate in, and with the power he plays with, maybe those can even be on early downs. Maybe he won't be limited to just a pure pass rushing role. I think it's an intriguing situation right here, and I think he's done everything they've asked of him so far. So Michael Clemens, I think, a guy a lot of people are going to have their eye on tonight. Not so much for the reasons I talked about with the other guys. He's not fighting for a roster spot. He's going to be on the roster, but how much playing time can he get, and how productive can he be? Now, as we close out the Locked On Jets podcast today, we'll talk about some of the guys you'll see at the end of the game, the guys who play in the 3rd and 4th quarter. We're talking about 3rd and 4th stringers. Some of them are fighting for a roster spot. Some of them may be fighting for a practice squad spot. I'll tell you the ones I'll be focused on as we close out this Monday episode. You're hanging out with friends and putting back a few drinks, and then a few becomes a few too many. And as the evening comes to an end and people begin to head out, you think of calling for a ride, but no, you live nearby, you can make it home okay, you think it's no big deal. What are the odds you'll get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that could happen? Your car gets totaled, your insurance goes up, you lose your job, you could kill somebody. Everybody knows about the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often even deadly. However, that does not stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. Play it safe and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or somebody else's forever. Please, 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 if you're drinking, don't drive. Drive sober or get pulled over. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're previewing tonight's preseason game between the Jets and the Falcons. We've talked about some first-teamers I have my eye on. We've talked about some second-teamers I have my eye on. Let's talk about the guys who are going to be closing out the game. I think one guy everybody's focused on, or is going to be focused on, at least those of you who continue to watch the game through the end, Chris Streveler, the hero of, or one of the heroes of the victory over the Eagles, where he made a couple scrambles, he hit a couple passes on the last drive. Lots of hype has come from Streveler after this game. Is it merited? I mean, it's kind of cool. I mean, how many quarterbacks get to lead a game-winning drive in the NFL, even if it's just preseason? So I guess like that's kind of a cool thing. But is this guy like the Jets quarterback of the future? People have been talking about playing him as Zach Wilson's out, and I don't know that what we saw in that game really would justify that. I don't think he got to a second read once in all the time he played. Of his 6 completions, 4 of them were just kind of like him flipping the ball to a tight end on a drag route at the line of scrimmage. It was it's kind of a staple play of the Jets offense. The Eagles really couldn't figure it out. The guys who were playing for the Eagles really couldn't figure it out. And Streveler, for his part, has a reputation as more of a runner, more of a scrambler, not really a guy who's developed as a passer, but we'll see what he can do. I don't really see Streveler as a guy who's competing for a spot on the Jets roster, but maybe he can earn a practice squad spot. Maybe if he even impresses enough, he could earn a spot eventually, and maybe as like a package, bring in like a Streveler package where you use him as a runner. I mean, I don't see that happening immediately, but maybe he could develop into that. But we'll see what he can do. I think that the hype around Streveler has gotten to be a bit much, but you always like to see somebody build off a game where he leads the touchdown that wins the game. It's worth watching. Another guy I'm watching, Zonovan Bam Knight. His numbers were not spectacular last week. I think it was only like 13 yards on 6 carries, but you have to remember 3 of those carries were on the goal line, which means you're running it through traffic. Those carries are not built to give you much in the way of statistical production. That said, I thought he ran tough. I thought he ran through arm tackles. He showed he could run with power, which is one thing. But then he also set up that game-winning drive with a big kickoff return where he kind of showed a second gear, and he's reportedly been one of the guys who's been the standout of training camp thus far. Is there a spot on the roster for him? I would guess not. We know Breece Hall, Michael Carter are going to be the top 2 backs. My guess is the Jets are going to want to keep Tevin Coleman. I feel like they'll want to have a veteran back. I think the coaching staff likes Tevin Coleman, somebody who's going to be a steady presence back there if you only give him a few touches a game, if that. Somebody you may be able to call on for a game or two if you need to. I feel like he's the 3rd back. Who's the 4th back, though? Zonovan Bam Knight's got a shot to earn that role. And in this LaFleur offense, we know it's based on the quote-unquote Shanahan offense. We've seen it over and over where guys are given, you see backs just plugged in. The team suffers an injury, in the midway point of the season. You see someone heralded back, somebody who was maybe an undrafted free agent, somebody who may be a late-round pick, who just gets plugged in and is productive. I think Knight has shown some impressive traits. He did in the game. He has so far in training camp. A guy worth watching. He's a guy who you probably will not see at the early point of the season, but you always have to be on the lookout, especially in the system the Jets run, for one of those backs who may pop in the middle of the year after there's an injury and may be able to produce. And the last guy I have my eye on, maybe I don't know if he's a second teamer or a third teamer, Jabari Zuniga, who by all accounts has had a pretty strong training camp and played well against the Eagles, had a sack. He's got to do something special, I think. I feel like it's a numbers game at this point. Jets have a lot at the defensive end position, and it feels like the Jets kind of gave up on him a year ago because they cut him at the end of the preseason. He ended up spending a bunch of time on the practice squad, did get called up to active duty. I mean, he had a sack in that upset over the Bengals, but a guy that seems like the Jets have kind of moved on from. In fact, I kind of view the pick of Michael Clemens as a sign that Zuniga's time with the Jets was coming to an end because you have a new 3rd or 4th round developmental guy at the defensive end position, which to me seemed kind of ominous for Jabari Zuniga. I don't know what he can do. I mean, I think it's a tough spot. I just think it could be a numbers game, but if he does something special, if he does something to stand out, another sack or two, he can at least make it a tough decision for the Jets, or at least keep his name in the running for maybe a practice squad spot. Who knows? Maybe he could even end up with another team. Maybe some other team's watching him, and if they think he's got some ability, maybe he can earn a spot there. I think it's a tough spot for Jabari Zuniga. I just think it could be they just may not have enough space for him, but he can at least make it tough if he continues to play well. Now, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. Big shout out to subscribers to this podcast, and to join that group, just hit the subscribe button. You'll receive notifications as new episodes of Locked On Jets are posted. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review, and if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a thumbs up. Helps the channel out, and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy the game tonight. We'll be back tomorrow to talk about Game 2 of the preseason between the Jets and the Falcons.